Chapter 62. AN, please make sure to vote and leave a comment for each chapter, it really helps out the story. Chapter 62. Happy called in a new jet that was stationed in Spain. Unfortunately, this one was not a Stark jet, which meant that it would take much longer for them to return to the States than it had taken for Happy to get to Europe. As they waited with Mary Jane's father for the arrival of the plane, they found out pretty quickly that he had no intention of joining them. No, Mark had to stay in London to complete his assignment for General Ross, and Peter was honestly glad for it. It would be a lot less awkward having to share a private jet with his girlfriend's father when all Peter wanted to do was snuggle up to Mary Jane and keep reassuring himself that she was alive. Which was exactly what he did. They laid down on the settee couch on the private jet, with Mary Jane nestled close in his arms. A contented creature purred within his chest. The longer they spent cuddling, the more Peter felt his anxiety heal and his worries begin to cease. Because Mary Jane was alive. They spent little time talking, however, and mostly slept. The last few days had been draining for the both of them, and Peter really needed sleep to help him to recover faster from his injuries. It was probably the deepest sleep he's had since before the snap, now with his mind no longer plagued by stress and worry. They only woke several minutes before landing at the JFK airport, the sensation of the plane starting to decline and the change of air pressure waking them naturally. It was dark outside as Happy landed the plane before driving it into a private Stark hangar. From there, they were directed toward the baggage claim area of the airport, where Peter and Mary Jane walked hand in hand as they maneuvered around straggling people. But amongst the crowd, two women stood out. Mary Jane. A weeping Annabelle Watson exclaimed as soon as she noticed her niece's striking red hair. A gasp tore out of MJ's chest as she spotted the aunt that she loved, before she dropped Peter's hand and began rushing toward the woman's open arms, where she was immediately engulfed within the motherly embrace. Peter couldn't help grinning wide as he took in the scene, his eyes misting at how touching the reunion was. Mary Jane was outright sobbing with a watery smile on her face as she pulled back from Annabelle just enough so that the two could peer at each other's faces, as though trying to memorize features. A shift of movement caught Peter's attention out of the corner of his eye as he watched his Aunt May approach him with redness in her eyes. Peter beamed as soon as he spotted her and took the measured steps forward to crush her into his arms. "Hey, Aunt May." It was so good to see her again. Grappling at his back, she clutched him to her before one of her hands held the back of his head. "Oh, Peter, I was so worried." Gulping slightly, Peter pulled back and gave her an apologetic look. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Aunt May said with a shake of her head as she brought her hand up to cup his cheek tenderly. He basked in her motherly touch, leaning into it subconsciously. "I'm so proud of you. You did the right thing." Smiling softly at her, Peter felt the warmth of contentment blossoming in his chest. For once, he felt that he actually earned her pride. "Thanks, Aunt May." Blinking rapidly to try and rid herself of the tears in her eyes, May shook her head and forced chipperness in her voice and expression. "We have so much to catch up on." It was as she said this, she directed a sly look over in Mary Jane's direction, who was still being held tightly in Annabelle's arms as they whispered softly to one another. "That we do," Peter said with a chuckle, as he also looked discreetly over toward Happy, who was standing awkwardly on the sidelines. Even as he gazed longingly at Aunt May. Honestly, could he make it any more obvious? It was then where Annabelle and Mary Jane finally released one another. And MJ was so cute as she wiped hastily at her cheeks with the backs of her hands, trying to brush away the tear stains there. He wanted nothing more than to take over where Annabelle left off and gather her close, but then he was distracted away from her as Annabelle suddenly turned towards him and made her approach, before immediately capturing him in an embrace. The older woman crushed him to her tightly as May looked on with a fond smile before turning to Mary Jane herself to give her a warm greeting. Annabelle turned her head and kissed Peter on the cheek. "Thank you for returning her to me, Peter. You're a good boy." Cheeks flaming, Peter flushed under the praise as she pulled away and looked up at him with such awe and gratitude shining from her green eyes, so similar to Mary Jane's. "Trust me, Annabelle, I had my own motivations for wanting to get Mary Jane back." "So I hear." The older woman tittered with a not-so-supple wink in his direction. Now his ears felt warm on top of his cheeks. Annabelle pulled away just as May and Mary Jane stepped toward them, and Annabelle had no qualms tucking her niece under her arm as she rested her cheek on top of Mary Jane's red hair. May approached him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder before stating, "Now, You must be exhausted. We should get you home. Blinking, Peter's head snapped over to look at her in mild surprise. He didn't think that she would ever call the small dingy apartment in the Bronx a home. Home? Oh. May suddenly brightened, her body quivering in her excitement to tell him the news. That's right. I found us an apartment in Queens. It's a bit smaller than what we're used to, but hope fluttered in his chest. And he cut her off by sweeping her up in another hug. You're so amazing, May. I'm sorry I wasn't here to help you. Making a sputtering noise in the back of her throat, May waved him off as she pulled back from the embrace. You don't need to be responsible for everything, sweetie. There are some things that I can manage on my own, so don't waste a second more feeling guilty when you had more pressing matters to address in Europe. She waited until she got his nod before continuing. Now, I only signed the lease about 2 days ago, so we'll still have to move a lot of our stuff out of storage. Peter nodded along to this newfound information. He seriously couldn't believe it. They had a home. In Queens. We can start that tomorrow. He seriously felt as though he could jump over the moon. Everything in his life was starting to come back together again. Yes, he lost Mr. Stark. But his experience over the last few weeks made him realize how much he appreciated the people that he loved and trusted in this life: Mary Jane, May, Ned, Harry, Happy. I can help, Mary Jane piped up with a lingering look in Peter's direction, full of such brightness and an eagerness to help that Peter's knees became a bit weak. She was so stunning. You should probably take it easy, dear, Aunt Anna tried to interject, her voice concerned as she eyed Mary Jane's form. She was still a bit underweight from her experience of near starvation in Italy. I feel fine, Aunt Anna, Mary Jane insisted, as she pulled away from under her aunt's arm so that she could better see the other woman's face. Just a bit tired, but nothing that a good night's sleep can't cure. Are you sure, Red? Peter asked. On one hand, he didn't want her to overexert herself. But on the other hand, he wanted nothing more than to be able to spend the day with her. Separating for tonight was going to be difficult enough. In the week that they spent each night in each other's arms, he'd already gotten used to her body heat. Her head resting on his chest. Her deep, rhythmic breathing. Absolutely, Mary Jane nodded with a grin, her eyes dazzling. He immediately buckled under the weight of it. Let her have whatever she wants. Just so long as she kept looking at him just like that. Think of me as your own personal moving service. How can I when I already think of you as the best girlfriend in the world? Peter blurted out without thinking, but for once, his word vomit didn't get him into trouble. It had the opposite effect, actually, as he watched Mary Jane's already smiling lips grow possibly wider. Ah. Both May and Anna cooed, which had Peter flushing as he remembered that they had an audience. I can't be seen as more than two things at once? Mary Jane teased as she took a deliberate step closer in his direction. Of course, Peter said, his eyes watching the movement of her feet, you're also the girl that never seems to know when to stop teasing me. She snickered before she stepped even closer and wrapped her arms around his neck in a hug. Her curves felt divine against his body. I'll see you tomorrow, Tiger? It was so natural, the way that his arms wound themselves around her waist. Looking forward to it. It suddenly hit him again that they were going to separate for the night. As well as every night from now on. A pang surged through his lungs at the thought as his breath left him in a whoosh. He's gotten so used to her presence that it now physically hurt him to be saying goodbye. Sighing and aware of their audience, Peter turned his head and placed a lingering kiss on her cheek. Somehow, he would rather withstand the wrath of Molten Man than that of Annabelle Watson. The matriarchal woman was so much more fearsome to Peter than all the steam that Mark Watson stewed. And he had a feeling that she wouldn't appreciate it if Peter kissed Mary Jane in the way that he wanted to. Sweet dreams, Red. Don't let the bedbugs bite, Spider. She had a sad smile on her lips as she pulled away from him and walked away with her Aunt Annabelle leading the way, and Peter couldn't help but think that she was feeling the same loss that he felt at their separation. But damn, was it quite the sight to be watching the gentle sway of her hips as she walked away. It was as Happy was driving them down the highway toward Queens when Peter suddenly spotted it. He shifted abruptly out from under Aunt May's arm, who had taken the seat next to him in the back, and very nearly pressed his face against the window in order to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Because blocking a part of the Manhattan skyline stood a huge advertisement board that exclaimed, Rogers, the musical, with a large silhouette of Captain America with his red, white, and blue shield. What in the actual fuck is that? Peter couldn't help but blurt out in a rush. There was a sudden pounding of a heartbeat in his ears. Peter. Language, Aunt May chided. Sorry. Sorry, it's just. He trailed off, unable to vocalize exactly what his eyes were seeing. Aunt May sighed as they finally drove past the sign. I know. Truly disrespectful, isn't it? Ah. Yeah. It is. That was seriously putting it mildly. Especially since he knew that Captain America never came back from returning the Infinity Stones. At least, that was the last he's heard. Aunt May sighed again and wrapped an arm around him again, pulling him back into her side. I'm sorry, Peter. I know it's still hard. After everything that's happened. Right. By everything she meant the fight against Thanos. It was so strange though, because that fight almost felt like a dream now. Like he hadn't actually been there and all his memories had him viewing the events from up above, from an aerial point of view, in his mind's eye. But perhaps that had more to do with the events that followed rather than the actual fight itself. Maybe his mind was beginning to suppress the memories. Yeah. Well. Let's just say that I hope that MJ doesn't want to see this particular musical, Peter said with a shake of his head and a swallow against the lump in his throat. I don't think that I could stomach it. Me either, Happy said from the front seat. All of them deserved so much better than this. Peter could only find himself agreeing slightly. The original core team of the Avengers certainly didn't deserve this amount of disrespect. But after the fight with Thanos, everyone else just disappeared. Left Peter on his own to scramble with the leftover pieces of such a broken and confused world. He was no longer as angry as he had been about it in Italy, but it still left a bitter taste in his mouth. Still, he didn't want to burst Happy's bubble, so he made a noise of agreement before he forced himself to relax by placing his head on Aunt May's secure shoulder. Her protective arms made him feel like he could finally let his guard down after so many weeks on edge. Several minutes passed and Peter watched with a pair of brand new eyes as they finally pulled up to a brownish brick building. It was old. And not as modern-styled as they were used to. But Peter wasn't going to complain. It was now his home. And he was grateful. As Happy parked next to the curb and they all filed out of the car, Happy took the liberty of grabbing Peter's suitcase from the trunk. As he waited on the sidewalk, Peter took the time to take out his phone before he typed in his old apartment address into his Maps app, and grinned at the results that came up on his phone. Only a little over 5 miles away from where Mary Jane lived. Perfect. Doing quick math in his head, he deduced that it would only take him about 10 minutes to web swing to her apartment whenever he wanted to see her. Never before had he been more glad that Aunt May had managed to get them back into Queens rather than continuing to live in the Bronx. Quickly, he texted Annabelle the address to their new apartment, with a note underneath to please give it to Mary Jane. She still didn't have a new cell phone yet where he could communicate with her directly. As they made their way up the apartment building steps, since there was no elevator, Peter offered numerous times to a huffing Happy if he wanted to hand over Peter's suitcase, but the man resolutely refused. And it left Peter wondering if Happy was trying to prove something, either to himself or May. Unlocking the front door to their apartment, May opened the door wide before handing Peter a copy of his own key, which he took and pocketed before taking a few steps inside as he took a look around. The apartment was still an open concept, but was at least half the size of their last one. And it looked like May had already managed to get some of the furniture into their place already without Peter's help, with a couch, a few chairs, the kitchen table and the TV already set into place. Happy continued to struggle with the heavy suitcase as he shuffled along into the living room, where he plopped it down on the floor before promptly falling back into a recliner with a heaving breath. Peter exchanged a look with May, who was pressing her lips together in an effort to not laugh aloud at the man's stubbornness. Taking the time to remove his jacket, Peter hung it in the closet next to the door before toeing off his shoes. Happy also utilized the time by catching his breath for a few minutes. "Bailed," Happy finally said as he slapped his thighs before beginning to stand from the chair he fell into. I guess I'd better get going." Oh no. He wasn't going to get away that easy. "Hold on a minute, Happy," Peter said as he turned and looked on at the man with narrowed eyes and pursed lips before shifting them to look over at his Aunt May. Sensing immediate unease from the older man he called a friend, Peter pointed between the two of them. "Why don't you two take a seat on the couch?" Happy shot a look toward May, who shrugged at him with a carefree, yet perplexed, expression on her face. "Why do you want us to sit on the couch, Peter? I better get going." You must be tired and happy, Peter interrupted, his voice bridging for no argument. Just sit on the couch. Right, Happy said with a haphazard nod as he rushed to comply. I'll just, Leisurely, Aunt May walked up to the love seat and sat next to Happy before settling in a relaxed pose as she crossed her legs. Happy was sitting so ramrod straight and sweating so profusely that Peter had to bite his tongue in order to hold in his laughter. It was difficult. But he wanted to keep his serious visage. Peter pulled up a kitchen chair and set it backward in front of the couch. Sitting down, he crossed his arms over the back of the chair and just looked at the pair of them for a solid several seconds, trying to pick up on any telltale clues that would indicate that there was something more going on. So, it's time for the truth to be out there. Peter began, his voice serious as he continued to eye the two adults like a hawk. Are you dating? Not even a second passed before. Yes, Happy breathed out in a heaving sigh, looking relieved that the truth was finally out in the open. Peter was genuinely surprised that he cracked under pressure so immediately. But Aunt May's eyes widened as her head whipped over to look at the man sitting next to her, her expression perplexed. No. We're not. Peter furrowed his brows in confusion at the contradicting statement. Jolting as though he were electrocuted, Happy spun his whole body to face her directly. We're not? Poor Aunt May looked so uncomfortable as she shifted her weight on her seat, now turning her head away from Happy's blazing look as she avoided eye contact and gave a nonchalant shrug. I mean, we're just hanging out. Having fun. Having fun? Peter couldn't help but echo before he shivered in disgust. The way that his aunt said that left no argument in his mind as to exactly what it was she meant. And he hated being partial to the knowledge that his aunt was having sex with Happy. Dear God. Hey. Happy barked as he pointed an accusing finger Peter's way. I didn't say anything when I saw you and Mary Jane share a kiss at the airport in my rear-view mirror after the dance. Peter couldn't help but sputter at the sudden accusation being laid at his feet. But that was just a kiss, Happy. Humming, Aunt May nodded in agreement with a sort of half-smile and a one-shouldered shrug. A kiss is different. Ugh. This seriously took a turn toward the weird. He needed to refocus them and try to get some actual answers here. Look at how you're both acting as a clue on how you wanted to keep it secret from me. No, Petey, May said as she waved him off, I would never keep something like this from you. He knew in his heart that it was true. She wouldn't hide such a big life change from him. But then why were they acting so weird? Peter's eyes shifted between the two of them uncomfortably, sensing the lack of resolution between them. Then maybe the two of you should talk. And make sure you're on the same page. After all, talking did wonders for his and Mary Jane's relationship. Keeping secrets before was what had been actively keeping them apart. I thought we were. Happy muttered, suddenly glum. Peter couldn't help but feel bad for him. But his words seemed to have the opposite effect on May, her proverbial feathers most definitely ruffled. I mean, you never asked me to be exclusive, Aunt May pointed out with a huff as she crossed her arms over her chest. I was waiting for the perfect moment. Happy countered, his hands getting more animated the more worked up he got. Why do I suddenly feel like a relationship therapist? Peter interjected, feeling the epitome of awkward, but neither of them heard him. You didn't think that the perfect moment was when you were kissing my kawaii. Peter interrupted loudly as he abruptly stood from the chair, nearly knocking it over in his haste. I'm going to go to bed now. Try to work this out quietly because I think I've had enough trauma to last me a lifetime. Aunt May peered over at him with a flush coloring her cheeks, suddenly remembering that certain private things probably shouldn't be aired out in front of her nephew. Sorry, Pete. Good night, Peter, Happy muttered quietly. Good night. Shifting in her seat a bit, Aunt May pointed down the hall. Your bedroom is the one down the hall on the right, sweetie. I set up your bed already for you. Thanks, May, Peter said as he ran a hand through his hair before flashing her with the smallest of smiles as he added, we'll talk more tomorrow. Getting a nod in return, he left them in awkward silence. Bringing his suitcase with him, Peter entered the room May indicated and took in all the sparse walls and floor. The only thing in the room was the actual bed itself. He actually sighed as he spotted it. He missed his bed. Stepping forward, Peter set down the suitcase on the mattress, opened it and grabbed his toothbrush and toothpaste. When he left his room and crossed the hall to the bathroom, He heard low murmuring coming from the living room, and Peter genuinely hoped that they worked it all out. He liked Happy. And sure, it was sorta weird for him to see Aunt May with anyone else outside of Uncle Ben, but he was gone. And May deserved to be happy. That is, if she allowed herself to be happy with someone else. Peter knew just how much she missed Uncle Ben. Sighing, Peter quickly completed his nightly routine before returning to the bedroom, where he stripped down to nothing but his boxer briefs and slipped under the covers of his bed. Without Mary Jane to text goodnight, Peter fell asleep right away, feeling the lingering traces of exhaustion seep out of him from so many weeks of stress. Peter's internal alarm clock woke him up pretty early, his body not quite used to the Eastern Standard Time zone quite yet. So, he got out of bed and slipped on the first t-shirt that he found from his suitcase before stumbling out into the hall, barefoot and rubbing at his bleary eyes with his fist. "Morning, sleepyhead," May called out from the kitchen, her back to him as she faced the countertop. "Morning," Peter's voice croaked out, sounding scratchy, and it garnered his aunt's attention as she turned her head to peek at him. What she saw made her eyes widen comically. "You look like you rose from the dead, Mr. Zombie Boy," May teased lightly as she turned back to the coffee pot in front of her, grabbed the handle, and poured herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, my sleep schedule is all messed up," Peter said with a stretch of his arms over his head, before he lowered them and leaned his side against the counter where he nodded his head at May's coffee cup. "You happen to have more of that? I think I need some today." "You never drink coffee," May said, surprised even as she turned and grabbed another mug from the cupboard. "You were always so hyperactive that we were afraid that any added caffeine would drive you up a wall." This caused Peter to laugh lightly. He had been quite the hyper child. "Funnily enough, I always drive myself up walls these days without caffeine," Peter joked with a smirk, which had May snorting as she poured the remaining hot liquid from the pitcher into the mug. "Plus, I don't think that you'll have to worry about any hyperactivity today. My bones are still a bit sore from the London fight." May nodded as she pushed forward the mug as it scraped across the countertop, and Peter took it gratefully, inhaling the intoxicating smell of black coffee before taking a drink. The hot liquid felt good on his scratchy throat. "Happy told me a little bit of what happened last night." Peter set down the mug and nodded, not quite sure how to respond. May suddenly took a step forward and enveloped him into a hug. "I'm so sorry, honey. That man. If he was still alive," she broke away, a dangerous look in her eyes, "I would strangle him with my own bare hands for daring to mentally and emotionally manipulate you like that." "I have no doubt that you would have been successful too, May," Peter said with a weary smile. "You can be terrifying once you go into Mama Bear mode." But she didn't seem to hear him as she continued on with her emotional tirade. "And when you were still grieving too? And with Mary Jane missing and—" "It's fine, May," Peter interrupted by gently grabbing her hands in both of his own. "I'm honestly over it. You have no idea how cathartic it was to beat him at his own game. He has no power over me anymore, even now that he's gone. Spider-Man won." "You bet your ass Spider-Man won," she said with a beaming, prideful grin as she pulled free her hands and poked at his chest. "Now, you must be starving. I haven't had the chance to get any of our kitchen stuff out of storage, so I took the liberty of buying us some blueberry muffins. That okay?" Peter grinned before he bent down and kissed her cheek. "Sounds delicious, May, thank you." May seemed to preen under the praise. With coffee mugs in hand, they sat down at the table as May reached into the paper bakery bag already on the tabletop and slid over a muffin his way. Recognition hit him as he noticed the logo on the muffin paper cup. "Are these from Westdown Bakery?" Peter asked as he perked up. "Yeah, I know that they're your favorite," May said, pleased with herself as she watched Peter rip off a chunk of the baked good before popping it into his mouth with gusto. "You deserve a treat after the hell you've been through. This already makes up for every bad thing that's happened to me lately, May, thanks." She sent him a sly look. "I suppose there's that. And getting yourself a cute girlfriend too more than makes up for it, Peter released a bit of a shy chuckle, his neck getting suspiciously warm. He knew that she wanted to approach the subject of Mary Jane, and he supposed that was one way of doing it. "Yeah, well, that goes without saying, May." Leaning ever closer across the table, her eyes sparked with intrigue. He surmised that she probably couldn't help herself. He never had a girlfriend before, so this was fascinating new territory for her as his guardian. "I'd still like to hear you say it." How could he even begin to put into words what his feelings were for Mary Jane? How could he describe the tight sensation in the pit of his stomach whenever he heard her carefree laughter? Or the way it felt as though his heart would quite literally beat out of his chest just from one glance in his direction from those beautiful emerald eyes? The truth was, he simply couldn't. There were no words. But he could still try. Mary Jane is everything, Peter breathed. She's so understanding of every aspect of my life, and has my back no matter what. She's so funny. And profound. And she's pretty. Don't forget that she's pretty. No, she's gorgeous. Peter contradicted before he found himself melting into his chair as his fingers absent-mindedly tore off chunks off his muffin, stuck in a daydream of Mary Jane's fiery locks blowing in the breeze on top of the cathedral in Venice. I'm actually in love with her, May. A delighted gasp escaped May, even as her eyes widened comically. So soon? Peter shrugged, not anywhere near feeling ashamed of his feelings. To him, loving Mary Jane Watson made the most practical sense in the world. To not love her would be the same as 2 + 2 = fish, completely illogical. We've been through so much together, it's almost like we're only now allowed to enjoy the honeymoon stage of our new relationship. Most people can't say the same. Most people also can't say that their girlfriend has saved their life on more than one occasion. It was with bated breath where Peter watched May mull over his words. Before she finally nodded in acceptance. True. Have you told her yet? Peter bit his bottom lip. This was where a bit of his old insecurities found him again. Not yet. Like you said, it's so soon. I don't want to scare her away by going too fast, too soon. That would be a nightmare. What if she feels the same way? Peter's heart fluttered at the thought of Mary Jane loving him. It was like a dream. If that's the case, then I'll wait until she's ready to tell me, Peter said with a little shrug of his shoulder. I'm fine waiting, May. Especially if I get to be with her while I do that waiting. Taking a moment, May eyed him carefully, before she made her observation aloud. You've grown up while you were away. Peter blinked. He supposed he did feel a bit more grown up, mature, than he had been before the snap. I suppose I have. I also had to learn some harsh lessons the hard way. That was putting it mildly. He now had so much more trust in himself than he had before in his entire life. He was no longer going to blindly trust others unless he knew for certain that they had earned that trust. Speaking of lessons, May said craftily, obviously trying to keep a lid on her transparent excitement, as she stood from her chair and went toward the kitchen counter where a pile of mail was waiting there. She grabbed one specific envelope, which had been torn open already, before she brought it back to the table with her as she sat down. I got this letter while you were away. The school board was trying to decide what to do with the blip suddenly coming back. It took a second for Peter to catch on to her meaning, and when he did, he nearly gaped at the implications of so many people in one city suddenly reappearing again without any notice. I suppose that the teachers would be overwhelmed by having so many students in a classroom all at once. What a nightmare. Obviously, students still needed to go back to school, but there was so much demand and not enough supply. The public school system had already been struggling before the snap. Now, it must be something to the equivalent of being a dumpster fire. May nodded. Exactly. So, they came up with a solution. A placement test. A brow raised up on his forehead. A placement test? Had the world somehow adapted to the rules of Hogwarts while he was dead for 5 years? Was he expected to put on some old, talking wizard's hat? Because that was sort of what it sounded like, enough so that he had to hold in a snicker. May nodded again, even more eager. It's a test to see if any students are capable of advancing a grade. Seniors who pass can take the first semester off to prepare for college. And juniors who pass can advance to being seniors, basically taking their place. Peter immediately caught on to what she was implying. So, if I pass the test, I can skip junior year and be a senior? The idea was very appealing. He had dreams of going to MIT, Mr. Stark's alma mater. He wanted to get his degree in biophysics and electrical engineering, before working his way up in Stark Industries. However, he wouldn't accept any handouts on a cushy position from Ms. Potts. Instead, he would insist that he would earn his way on his own merit. Oh, please, Peter, May scoffed with a wave of her hand, if you pass? We both know that you'll pass with flying colors. You never know. The test could be extremely difficult, Peter mused modestly as he took the letter from May's hand, his eyes immediately roaming the page. It says that the test is on August 15th. That gave them only 3 weeks to prepare. But he supposed that trying to cram as much information into their brains as possible wasn't really the point of the test. They didn't want them to try and force their way into passing. Just simply wanted to find out what their scholastic level was already at. "My baby boy is going to be a senior this year," May exclaimed as she leaned forward and pressed a kiss onto the side of his head. "Yeah, I just might be." Peter mused with a small grin, recognizing that there was no point in denying the fact that he was ridiculously smart. There was a reason why Mr. Stark had allowed for him to go wild in his lab sometimes, and that was because the man had trusted him around so much expensive equipment and chemicals without breaking anything or blowing anything up. It was strange how he was starting to view his memories of his time together with Mr. Stark through a fond and nostalgic lens. Yes, he would always deeply miss the man, but he was now free of the burden of guilt surrounding his death. It made mourning Mr. Stark easier to contend with. "Is this statewide?" Peter asked, as his eyes skimmed the letter, looking for the answer. But May answered before his gaze could find it. "Yes. The governor announced the decision just a week ago." Peter looked down at his letter, considering, before he popped another chunk of muffin into his mouth. That means that Mary Jane will be taking the test too. Every student in the state was set to take the test, actually. This was suddenly a much bigger deal than he had initially thought. A concerned look crossed May's expression at the mention of Mary Jane. "Do you think that she'll be ready for the stress of such a big test after everything she's gone through?" That was also a consideration, wasn't it? She had been doing so remarkably well in her recovery that Peter sometimes found himself basking in her good moods rather than remembering that she had actually been through an ordeal. Would she be stable enough to confidently take a test that would help decide the course of her foreseeable future? When he thought of it that way, the prospect was rather daunting. "I'm not sure," he began, uncertain. "What I do know is that Mary Jane is strong and can usually handle anything that's thrown her way in life." It was the truth. With all of his super strength, Mary Jane was still somehow so much stronger than him, able to adapt and withstand anything. There was a reason why he thought of her as his hero. "The way you talk about her is so adorable," May sighed happily as she took a sip of her coffee. Mimicking her, Peter brought his own mug to his lips and took a drink before he lowered it and grinned. "Speaking of relationships, are you going to tell me what happened last night with Happy?" He watched as a transformation overcame May, where she almost turned shy as he back when ramrod straight. "We, agreed to take things slow. See where life takes us before we decide to get too serious." Peter watched her closely as her fingers began tearing apart her own muffin, before he prodded, "But you're dating?" A small, secret smile twitched at the corners of May's lips. "Yeah. We're dating." Peter beamed. "Congrats, May." "I'm glad. I like Happy." "You do?" May asked, hopefully uncertain. Was she really that concerned about his opinion on the matter? If he had expressed distaste for the idea, would she have ended things with Happy? The thought kinda made him sad. That she would continuously put her life on hold just for his sake. But not anymore. May would find nothing but support coming from his end. "Of course. He's a good man. And I trust him to treat you right." He watched as slowly, carefully, her entire demeanor brightened, and he knew that she really had been holding out for his opinion before fully committing. "Look at us, huh? No longer living the single life." Throwing her head back, May laughed. "Yeah, I suppose we'll both actually start having weekend plans, huh? You know. Besides watching soap opera reruns for me or swinging out as Spider-Man for you." Peter couldn't help but snicker. "I'll probably still do that, actually. I'll just take Mary Jane with me," Peter said with a little wink in her direction before he popped a piece of the muffin into his mouth. "Speaking of Happy, while you were gone, he helped me launch a charity called FEAST." Mary Jane came over a few hours later, ringing on the intercom for his apartment outside as Peter scrambled to press the button that would allow her entry. When several minutes passed, as she climbed the stairs, she finally knocked on the door and Peter, who had been standing and waiting for her, immediately turned the knob and whipped the door open so fast that it nearly tore itself off its hinges. It couldn't be helped. His eyes immediately began roaming her figure, taking in her delectable curves underneath her form-fitting ensemble. She was wearing a black, lace crop top underneath a green zip-up hoodie paired with dark blue jeans. But no matter what she wore, she was the epitome of sex appeal. Nearly everything about her drew him in. "Would you look at that?" Peter mused lightly as his gaze confined to rake over her body. "I just keep hitting the jackpot, don't I?" Eyes widening in mild surprise at his greeting, Mary Jane giggled and Peter beamed wide at having managed to get her to laugh. He opened his arms wide and in the very next moment, she stepped forward into them before he latched them around her waist, squeezing her tight before he lifted her slightly off the floor, pressing his nose into her hair as he inhaled her flowery shampoo. "One would think that you're starting to get rather greedy by winning all these jackpots," Mary Jane jibed back as Peter finally returned her to her feet. It was Peter's turn to laugh, his hand automatically finding her own without his conscious decision. "I missed you." Lips quirking, she squeezed his hand back. "But you only saw me last night?" His free hand came up to massage at the back of his neck. "Yeah. But time is relative, right? And from my perspective, it feels like an eternity since I've been able to hold you in my arms." Giving a pretend pout, her free hand came up to cup his cheek. "My poor tiger. An eternity is a long time. However, did you cope?" Peter shrugged one shoulder, acting as though he were relaying some sort of trauma. "I had to settle with hugging myself, actually." Mary Jane hummed, "And what did you have to settle for instead of my kisses?" Peter dropped his arm from his neck and showed her his closed fist. "Would you believe me if I told you that I drew an exact replica of your lips on my fist?" Throwing her head back in delight, Mary Jane couldn't hold back her giggles. "Oh no. That's a poor substitute, indeed. Right? I'm like a man dying of thirst here. Is that your way of calling me a tall glass of water?" "Among other things." She tittered, before her voice came out in a purr, "Come here, tiger." "Oh." He came very willingly as he bent his head down to capture her lips with his own. Her kiss was as soft as silk. So much better than kissing his hand, despite him having made that part up. Her breath tasted like spearmint, the coolness of it contradicting with her warmth. His hands began to roam her back, feeling the hidden curves with his fingertips firsthand. "And, is that Mary Jane?" May called out from her bedroom, accompanied by the sounds of shuffling clothes as she changed. Groaning, Peter's lips unlatched from Mary Jane's with a sigh. "I thought that being back home would have meant that we wouldn't be interrupted all the time?" He muttered to her quietly, before stating in a louder voice to May, "Yeah, it's her. Are we almost ready to go?" "We have time," Mary Jane whispered back reassuringly to him as she placed a quick kiss on his cheek, before calling out, "Hi May." Aunt May waltzed out of the bedroom, fully dressed and ready to tackle the day, with a welcoming grin and immediately swept his girlfriend up in a hug. "Hi, sweetheart." Mary Jane hugged his Aunt May back and the jaded part within him, the part that wanted to spend quality time alone with his sexy girlfriend, melted somewhat at the sight of the two of them together. Two of his most favorite girls in the world. And they got along so nicely. How had he ever managed to get so lucky? Aunt May then pulled away and surveyed Mary Jane's face. "You look so beautiful today. Did Peter tell you yet that you look beautiful today?" "Can't say that he has." Mary Jane snickered while giving Peter the side eye. With that statement, it felt as though a bucket of ice-cold water was poured over his head as he was forcibly yanked out of his fond introspection. Gaping, Peter held up a warning finger at May. "Hey." I may not have said it in those exact words, but it was definitely implied. They both simply laughed at him and his reaction, and Peter was forced to take it all in stride as he continued to be brutally teased by the pair of them. After some discussion, they decided to bite the bullet and rent a pickup truck for the day from the local hardware store. It would be easier to have the vehicle to utilize rather than having to take multiple trips back and forth from the storage unit and their apartment. Peter sat wedged in the middle seat of the truck bench between May and Mary Jane as his aunt navigated the Queens streets. They were several blocks down the road already when he suddenly noticed that they drove past his school MSST. Glancing slyly over to his side at the gorgeous redhead under his arm, Peter couldn't help but notice that Mary Jane became aware of the school as well. "You know," Peter began, his voice prodding as he garnered her attention away from the window, "you could always enroll into MSST? There's still time, I bet." Biting her bottom lip, she seemed to be weighing her words carefully, enough so that Peter already knew her answer before she even had to speak it. Disappointment spread through him, though he tried not to show it. As much as I would love to hang out with you every day, I don't want to give up on Rosalind's. They have connections to Broadway, and if I play my cards right. She broke off with a shrug and a shy smile. Sighing, Peter reached down and grasped her hand, threading their fingers together. I understand. We'll just have to get more creative when finding ways to spend time together. It would be a bit difficult to find a rhythm. At least at first. He had a duty, a responsibility, of going out on patrols as Spider-Man. But he also wanted to spend every free moment that he could with Mary Jane. He brought their connected hands up to his lips and kissed the back of her own, before bringing them down to rest on his thigh. Speaking of school, Aunt May piped up, has Belle told you about the placement test yet, Mary Jane? A flash of a severe expression change crossed Mary Jane's face at the mention of the placement test, that had Peter furrowing his brows in concern. She looked anxious. Yeah. About that, She broke off with a shuddering breath, her free hand picking at a stray thread on her jeans. I'm not all that sure that I'll pass. Frowning, Peter squeezed her fingers in his, trying to gain her full attention. Why do you think that? Nervously tucking some of her hair behind her ear, she shrugged and tried to give him a smile, but it came out as half-hearted and shaky. I'm nowhere near as smart as you, Tiger. I excel on the artistic side of school, but subjects like science have never come easy to me. I always struggle. First of all, you are smart, Red, Peter said with another reassuring squeeze of her fingers as he bumped his shoulder gently against her own. Yeah, and people are good at different subject matters, May added, and Peter glanced at her gratefully out of the corner of his eye. That is. Until she decided to continue speaking, trust me when I say, you never want to hear Peter sing. Thanks, May, Peter said with a little eye roll before he turned back to his girlfriend, who had giggled softly at his expense. And he was glad for it. He would willingly fall on the spear of humiliation just to make her feel better about herself. She's right, though. People are just naturally better at different things. I may be gifted in science, but you have the most beautiful singing voice, Red. Don't undermine your talents in the arts. The world wouldn't be able to function with its sanity intact without being able to shift focus toward entertainment rather than work for a change. Mulling over his words, Mary Jane became introspective as she bit her lip again. I guess I just don't want to be left behind. You'll probably pass with ease and be a senior. Then you'll graduate and get accepted to an Ivy League school while your high school girlfriend is only just starting her senior year. That was what she was afraid of? Did she think that Peter would outgrow her during that 1 year apart? The idea was so outlandish that his first instinct was to laugh. But then he realized that by doing so, he would only hurt her feelings. She was displaying some of her fears out in the open to him here. He would do good to treat them as though her feelings were valid, even though the ideas behind those feelings were so far off the mark. First off, I have faith that you can pass, Peter stressed, showing with his eyes just how much he believed in her. Second, if you don't pass, it wouldn't matter how far away I went for school. It wouldn't affect anything when it comes to you and I. I'd still miss you like crazy the entire time, and I would come home to visit basically every weekend. And third, if you're feeling that nervous about it, I could help you study? But only if you want to. He didn't want to apply any pressure on her. It was entirely her decision. He wanted to make it very clear that it didn't matter to him if she passed or not. In his mind, his future was already set, with Mary Jane Watson being at the forefront. She took a moment to consider his offer. I think I would feel better knowing that I went in giving it my all. Plus, with all the excitement that's happened these last couple of months, I think I need a refresher on some things. Taking a moment to smile gratefully up at him, she said in a strong voice, I'd be glad if you helped me study, Tiger. He beamed and bent down to kiss her cheek. I'll be the best study partner you've ever had, I promise. Mary Jane giggled at his enthusiasm as he continued to pepper kisses all over her face, delighting in the sound of her improved mood through laughter. You guys are adorable, May said with a fond smile, as they finally calmed down, and I'm sure you'll do great on the test, Mary Jane. You have to be the sort of girl with a sharp mind to keep up with this guy here. They both laughed, because it was true. Peter manhandled all of the heavier things on his own as they all traversed up and down the apartment stairs. Mary Jane took care of some of the lighter boxes labeled in Sharpie, Peter's clothes or kitchen, since her muscles were still building back up from her deficiency. As time passed, Peter could tell that she was beginning to get tired, but not once did she complain. Still, he was looking for an opportunity to slip in a break for the two of them to enjoy. But they had the truck rental to consider. And it charged by the hour. As they got the last of the boxes piled up in the living room, May announced that she was going to go return the truck to the hardware store. Peter hummed his acknowledgement as she left before he directed Mary Jane to his new bedroom, each with a box of his things tucked under both of their arms. As they stepped past the threshold into the bare room, apart from the bed, they began to stack the boxes on the floor up against the wall, leaving it for later for Peter to slowly pick through and organize. "Thanks again for helping me, Red," Peter said as he faced her with a grateful grin. Smiling up at him, she tucked some stray hair of hers behind her ear. "Anytime, Tiger. That's just the sort of thing a good girlfriend does, and I wanted to start off on the right foot." She winked at him before she made a show of turning around in a slow circle, scoping out the space of his bedroom as she took it all in with appraising eyes. She stopped when her eyes landed on his bed and she hummed thoughtfully. "So this is where I'll be spending a lot of my time from now on, huh?" Heart nearly seizing, Peter released a breath before it started beating double time in his chest. His body temperature rose as he found his gaze also wandering over to his empty bed. Peter's brows raised in shock. Was she? She couldn't possibly be implying? His dick gave a violent twitch in his briefs at the thought. Holy fuck. Holy fuck. Holy fuck. "In my bedroom?" Peter asked, his voice cracking slightly before he haphazardly cleared his throat. If that's what you want." Dear Lord. Were they discussing sex? Did she want to do it here? Now? Or was she implying that she was going to be ready in the near future? Or was it that she was ready to broach the subject matter with him to discuss before they took the first steps toward making love? Wait, was he ready for sex? His mind didn't even need a second to contemplate his decision. Fuck, yes. Was that even a question? Slowly, she tilted her head at him adorably, looking up at him through half-lidded eyes. The look that she was giving him was so erotic. Hot damn. Well. Yeah? You said that you were going to help me study, didn't you? The rug, quite literally, was torn out from under his feet as his breath left him in a whoosh. She smirked at him while Peter's jaw dropped, his mind unable to process what just happened. His eyes blinked rapidly as he tried to catch up with the situation at hand, but when he finally did, "Why you teasing, little minx?" Peter charged at her while Mary Jane screamed and tried to run away. But she was no match for his reflexes and didn't get very far as he scooped her up in his arms. Holding her captive, his lips immediately sought her as he strode them both over to his bed and promptly fell with her on top of the mattress, where they continued to make out. It didn't take long before their tongues got involved into the mix, and Peter nearly groaned at the taste of her sweet, teasing mouth. The way that the muscle moved against his within his mouth sent endless amounts of shivers coursing through his entire body. His hands twitched to touch at more of her skin. A most prominent desire that he had was his body's fixation in wanting to touch and knead at the swell of her tits. But he managed to resist. Instead, he focused on places that he knew for certain that he could touch. Down her arms. Up the outside of her thighs to her hips, where he grasped onto with both hands as he pulled her closer to him, just as he delved his tongue deep into her mouth. God, she tasted divine. His hardness was straining against his zipper, so uncomfortable that he couldn't stop himself from gently grinding it down into the mattress just to get some form of relief. He could only hope that she wouldn't notice and that he was keeping her plenty distracted with the way that he flicked his tongue in her mouth. Moaning, she arched her back slightly against him so that they were now chest to chest and fuck. Was that her nipples that he could feel straining through her crop top? Was she even wearing a bra? He couldn't hold back the groan from deep in his chest at the thought, because holy fuck, was that hot? Petite hands began to wander up and down his back, before going on to explore his sides, feeling the muscles that he had under the layers of clothing he had on. Thank God he wasn't wearing his spider suit right now. Moving his mouth from her lips to her neck, he began to lick and tease at the pulse point she had there as she keened and moaned underneath him. Peter. She breathed, her eyelashes fluttering as she fought against the sensations that he was delivering to her, and the click of the apartment door getting unlocked and creaking open caused for Peter to freeze. Aunt May was home. Fucking hell. Sighing, he returned to her mouth and resumed kissing her, but forced them to slow down significantly to gentle kisses. Before stopping completely. He almost got carried away there. Heaving in lungfuls of air, Peter got off from on top of her and forced himself to lay down on his back beside her. His cock was so hard. It physically hurt and was crying out for release. Which, it didn't help matters that Mary Jane immediately began running her hand up and down his chest in a tantalizing manner with her smooth fingers. The tickling sensations that gave tempted him beyond belief. He squeezed his eyes shut, thinking of anything that he could use to ease his discomfort. "You okay?" Mary Jane asked softly. Peter nodded in a jagged sort of manner as he forced his eyes open and gave her a tight smile. "Why, yeah. Everything's great." She softened her smile before scooting forward so that her chin was now resting on his chest. That was fun. It was fun, but he was certainly paying the price for it now. He had to think of something quick to cool himself off. The first thing that popped into his mind also happened to blurt out of his mouth as he asked, have you heard back from your dad on when he plans to come back to New York?" Recoiling a bit at the mention of her father after such a hot and heavy make-out session, Mary Jane took a moment to stare at him, unblinkingly, for a solid minute. Peter struggled against the awkwardness he felt, but it did the job. His hardness waned down to half-mast. Finally, she tilted her head and looked at him curiously, before shaking her head at herself, thankfully choosing to answer his question rather than look too deeply into the reason of why he suddenly cared. "Nothing as of yet. It's all kinda up in the air now. The attack that Mysterio did on London kinda screwed with the timeline on the mission, I think." Despite himself, he actually did find himself intrigued. They'd kept their subject matter rather light ever since they returned to New York. And with Mary Jane back at home with her aunt, he wondered if she managed to get around to asking specific questions when they were alone last night. And your mom? Did you ask your aunt about her?" Shaking her head, Mary Jane bit her bottom lip. "Not yet. Aunt Anna is over the moon with the fact that I'm back. I don't want to mess with that yet by asking heavy questions." She was as selfless as she always was. Always considering others and their feelings before her own. Especially when it came to those who she cared for. "Aren't you burning with curiosity, though?" Sighing, Mary Jane plopped herself onto her back so that they were both staring at his bedroom ceiling. "I'm more angry than anything. That she hasn't bothered to reach out at all. Some part of me doesn't even want to get into contact with her." Guiltily, Peter nodded, sort of feeling like an asshole for even bringing it up when her mood had been so light and happy. "I understand that." Humming, Mary Jane turned on her side again and ran her finger languidly down his chest again, seeming fixated on his muscles there. They were quiet for several moments, before Mary Jane finally whispered, "You've never talked about your parents before." It wasn't a question. Not really. Just an observation. But also an open invitation for him to divulge all if he chose to. He appreciated that she was being sensitive to his feelings, but she really had nothing to worry about regarding his parents. Sighing, Peter reached down and grabbed her hand before bringing it up to his lips to kiss, then he threaded their fingers together and placed them on top of his stomach. "Finally," he said, "there's not really much to say. They died when I was young. When he had been 7, to be precise." "What happened to them?" Mary Jane asked softly, carefully, but somehow sensing his willingness to delve in deeper. "It was a plane crash," Peter said before he let out a shuddering breath that came out sounding like a staccato. "I remember the day that I found out about it. It was awful." Memories of that day shot through his mind. All of the misery and tears. The feeling of being lost, unable to comprehend with his childlike mind what navigating a world without his parents would be like. Despite his earlier resolve, he did feel tears start to mist in his eyes as he pictured his parents' faces in his mind's eye. Unfortunately, Mary Jane noticed. An instant regret overcame her features. No. He didn't want her to feel bad for this. "I'm so sorry, Peter. You don't have to talk about them if you don't want to. But I'm here if you want to open up." He could tell by the longing in her eyes that she wished that he would open up, to let her in and see some of the most tragic aspects of his life. Peter was quiet for a lingering moment, not really considering whether he should confide in her or not, but mostly thinking of what words he wanted to say. Finally, he said, "I used to sit on the bathroom counter to watch my dad while he shaved." Squeezing his hand, Mary Jane continued to lend him her strength. Peter swallowed against the tightness in his throat and then continued. "I was always so fascinated, watching him shave. He was always so careful with every stroke of the blade, so deliberate with his every move. That was the sort of man my dad was. He would calculate every decision carefully in his mind before he even made it. It would drive my mom crazy sometimes, especially when it came to choosing a place to go out to eat. Mary Jane laughed softly at that, and Peter smiled fondly as he remembered a particular memory. There were actually more limited options of restaurants where we lived than what I'm used to now in the city. My parents had a small house upstate in Saratoga Springs. My mom liked the small town lifestyle. She wasn't too fond of visiting the city, but she put up with it a lot so that we could visit Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Tenderly, Mary Jane moved her head so that she could place a lingering kiss on his shoulder. Slowly, he let go of her hand as his arms wound around her waist, holding her close to his side. My mom. She could always talk a mile a minute. I remember my dad would always call her his social butterfly. And she had the silliest sense of humor. There was nothing coy about it, it was always right on the nose, but her jokes always had 6-year-old me rolling on the floor with laughter. He broke off with a small chuckle. She would always tell me that one of her biggest joys in life was to make me laugh. Turning his head, he kissed the top of her hair before inhaling the scent of her shampoo, using it to ground him in reality. He was dangerously close to getting lost in the past. While my dad always had a more dry sense of humor. I remember he would always have a derisive comment or two when he was reading the newspaper. He hated politics so much, and yet, he was still super invested in it. Tilting her head backward, Mary Jane lifted her eyes until they were connected with his own. They would be so proud of you, Peter. You think so? Peter couldn't help but ask, uncertain. I know so. How could they not be? She said with so much resolve that it quite literally squeezed at his heart. I often wondered about that over the years. Peter admitted aloud, revealing one of the deepest insecurities he's had ever since his parents had died. There was always that fear, that he would never measure up to what they had wanted them to be. But now I think you may be right. She smiled at his softly before tilting her mouth upward further so that her mouth could gently kiss his. When she pulled back, she asked, "Can you tell me about your Uncle Ben?" A sad smile came to Peter's lips. This wound was more tender than that of even his parents. He was like a second father to me. He was my dad's brother, but they were nowhere near alike. My dad was a scientist and very serious. But Uncle Ben, he was the hard-working sort. He made an honest living. Always tried to do the right thing. And he had a light-hearted outlook on life. Even if he wasn't the genius my dad was, Uncle Ben was so wise. He always knew just what to say in moments that made you stop and have to contemplate your life. He sounds amazing, Mary Jane said with a gentle sort of grin. No wonder you turned out so wonderful, Tiger. I wouldn't be the man I am today without his influence. It was more true than he was willing to delve into right at that moment. He wasn't quite ready to discuss the night that Uncle Ben died with Mary Jane. It was still his greatest shame. Thank you for telling me about them, Mary Jane said as she placed a lingering kiss against his neck. I know it probably wasn't easy. I love talking about them, actually, Peter interrupted, wanting to sway her fears. It feels like I'm keeping them alive with me whenever I do. It's just that. Some people get uncomfortable when you bring up the dead. You'll never have to worry about that with me, Mary Jane reassured, anytime you want to mention them. Or Tony Stark, I'll be here to listen. He kissed her lightly for that, his heart feeling so full. She really was everything that he needed in life. She always knew exactly what to say to make him feel better, to pull him out of the dark pit that he always found his mind falling into. In truth, she was his hope. His light. When he pulled away, he knew that there was a subject matter he needed to bring up with her before she left. But he was hesitant to break the mood. But he also promised no more secrets. I'm going after Lincoln tomorrow, he revealed with a serious tone of voice. Peter watched her face closely, looking for any sign of distress at the name of her abductor. Her brows rose in shock as she continued to stare at him for a full minute. It was clear by her eyes that she was processing this information. Until, finally, a thunderous expression overtook her visage as she said, "Be sure to kick him in the balls for me. Nice and hard." As Peter swung through the city, with resounding exclamations pointing out his return from the New York citizens below, he felt his righteous fury for L. Thompson Lincoln build within his very being, stemming straight down from his core. The bastard would pay for what he did to Mary Jane. And Peter would make sure that the message came across loud and clear: do not fuck with his loved ones. Because if anyone else tried to lay a hand on Mary Jane or May or even Ned and Harry, Peter really couldn't be held responsible for his actions at that point. Swing Through Manhattan now brought with it a feeling of familiarity, and Peter felt a level of calm join his anger. He was no longer trying to navigate unfamiliar landmarks, which only led to a level of disorientation. This was his territory now. Finally making it to the Lincoln skyscraper, Peter used his last upswing to launch himself higher in the air before he landed on the glass windows, attaching himself to the building. He didn't stop there, however. He immediately made his way up, crawling to one destination that was a part of his hyperfocus: the penthouse office. Say your prayers, Lincoln, Peter thought vindictively to himself as he quickly made his way to the top floor before ramming his fist into the glass of one of the windows, and doing a flip as he entered and landed gracefully in a crouch on the floor. Lincoln. Prepare to his voice cut off as he saw that the office was completely empty. All of the lights were off and there was a thin layer of dust on the military-grade computer that Peter had seen last time. Hello? He called out, despite it being obvious that there were no occupants in the room. But no one popped out to greet him with gunfire. There were no exclamations of his return for vengeance. And there was no L. Thompson Lincoln. This was not exactly going as planned. In his fantasy of this moment, he burst in through the glass from the outside, where Lincoln would cower in fear at his feet, begging for mercy. Which Peter would grant. But only after several fists to the face and, one kick to the groin, per Mary Jane's request. Once that was over with, Peter would deliver the man to the police, exposing his lies and the underground criminal empire that the man created. Then Peter would swing over to Mary Jane's apartment, where she would hopefully find his defense of her honor hot and proceed to kiss him senseless. But none of that could occur if the son of a bitch wasn't physically here. Spider-Man? A small voice called out from the other side of the room, and Peter's head jerked up, his eye lenses connecting with the wide-eyed gaze of Lincoln's secretary. Ms. Grant? Peter asked, his brows raising as he took her in. A shocked sort of odd smile graced her lips. You remember me? Nodding, Peter straightened from his crouched stance on the floor. Of course. You were a big help in getting me the information that I needed to find Miss Watson. Ms. Grant's grin softened into relief. So you found her? Peter couldn't help but smile a bit under his mask. This woman had so much integrity. Yeah, I did. And now I want to keep up with the promise that I made you in making sure that Lincoln sees justice. At this, her expression fell as she bit and worried her bottom lip. He's not here. So Peters noticed. But he was willing to wait. Ah. When is he coming back? He asked, before attempting to joke. I can make an appointment with you if necessary. He hasn't been here for over a week, Ms. Grant interjected as she shifted from foot to foot with unease. Not since your video released online. Peter cursed, turning away from her as his hands came up to cradle his head in his frustration. He knew that he went too far, threatening all of the crime lords. So there were unintended consequences to my threat. Then he suddenly turned on his heel, facing her again. Do you know where he is? Shaking her head sadly, she looked guilty that she couldn't do more for him. Not exactly. I do know that he's still in the city somewhere. He'd have to be to try and maintain his footing against Kingpin and the Green Goblin. Lincoln can't afford for any more of his business dealings to be stolen out from under his nose. That made sense. And it at least reassured Peter that the man was still within the city, underground. It wouldn't be impossible to find him, just more difficult. I'll try and find him, Peter vowed to her, about to launch himself out the window again, before he paused and considered her again. Is there anything else that you know? Nervously, she hesitated. And that reaction alone told Peter immediately that she did know something. Luckily, he didn't have to try and coax the information out of her, because it only took a moment of weighing her options before she divulged all. After that night where we met, I'd been doing some digging, paying closer attention to Mr. Lincoln's business dealings. And I found out some things. That sounded dangerous, Peter said, concerned. It would be one thing if she accidentally stumbled across information. But it was completely another thing for her to be actively snooping around in a crime lord's private information. It probably was, she said with what was supposed to be a nonchalant shrug. But I'm sick of innocent people getting hurt. What a brave woman. Careful, you're starting to sound dangerously like a hero, Miss Grant, Peter said, light-heartedly, but also with a gentleness in his tone that he usually only reserved for those he respected. This caused for the woman to smile and for her tense shoulders to ease. What I found out was that there is a reason for the uptick on gang wars on the streets. You see, it's not just about territory. Mr. Lincoln, Kingpin, and the Green Goblin are after something. Something that they all want their hands on. Enough to fight over and let thousands of innocent people get hurt over in the process. What are they after? Peter asked immediately, as he crossed the room to get closer to her. A formula. She turned and walked out of the room and into the lobby. Peter followed immediately after her. She went behind her desk and he watched as she dug through a large stack of paper files before she found what she was looking for, plucked it out of the stack and handed it to him. Peter took it carefully in hand. It was on the black market before the snap, where the seller was planning to auction it off to the highest bidder. Apparently, the seller got the formula from a top-secret government agency, snuck into the building undetected and memorized the formula with a photographic memory. Glancing down at the paper as he listened to her speak, he saw a single piece of white paper with only one line written in the center in bold ink. Project PACHYDERM. It was just the cover letter that I managed to pluck, Miss Grant said anxiously as she wrung her hands together, but from what I gather, it's a formula that would make a superpowered being. Head snapping upward to connect his eye lenses with her wide gaze, Peter cursed again and began to pace back and forth in short intervals. Ugh. Not this again. They're seriously looking to create more supervillains? Peter agonized, before he skidded to a halt and whirled to face her, asking, who's the seller? A man by the name of Walter Hardy, but the thing is, Spider-Man, from what I hear, Mr. Hardy has had a change of heart. He was snapped by Thanos and came back with a blip. Now, he doesn't want to sell. Only, let me guess, Peter interrupted, his voice dry, his prospective buyers, Lincoln, Kingpin, and the Green Goblin aren't so understanding of his change of heart and still want their grubby little hands all over that formula? Ms. Grant nodded warily. So far, Mr. Hardy has managed to evade them all from what I hear. But he won't be able to outrun them forever. Eventually, one of them will get their hands on that formula. Sighing, Peter handed the piece of paper back to Ms. Grant, which she took gingerly as she waited anxiously for his response on what he planned to do. It was supposed to be simple. He was supposed to crash through here, obtain vengeance for Mary Jane, and throw a bad guy in prison. But now, he realized that nothing about his life was ever really meant to be easy, was it? Straightening his shoulders, he affirmed in a bold and strong tone of voice. Then I guess it's up to Spider-Man to stop them. So the plot thickens. Did any of you out there really think that Spider-Man fighting the mob bosses would be easy? Peter's personal life is going pretty great right now, so of course Spider-Man would be going through the thick of it. Please leave a comment below. Thanks for reading. Less than 3.